and a very warm welcome to Dateline London. I'm Carrie Gracie. This week, the UK living on the edge, with MPs about to vote on the most momentous question of the age, withdrawal from the European Union. Is it a time for conscience, a time for strategic vision, or tactical voting? We game out the moves for MPs, government and other key players on the great Brexit board. And after US-China talks in Beijing, where stand the trade hostilities which overshadowed the global economy throughout last year? In 2019, is this trade war to be hot, cold, on or off? My guests this week, Agnes Poirier of news magazine Marianne, Isabel Hilton of the website China Dialogue, Thomas Kielinger, author and longtime correspondent of Die Welt, and John Fisher-Burns of the New York Times. Welcome to you all. Agnes, I'm going to start with you on the question of Theresa May, famously resilient. The past week, another stress test for her. The government sustained 2 defeats in the House of Commons, and dead on delivery was the verdict on her withdrawal bill, even from many of her own MPs. But nothing daunted, the Prime Minister's mounted a last-ditch campaign to win over political enemies. Should we call this determination and admire it, or call it desperation and pity it? And what is Mrs May's next move if, as widely expected, her bill is defeated in the Commons on Tuesday? Agnes, I said I was going to start with you, and I am. Is it determination we should admire, or is it desperation we should pity?
Well, how to not be unrespectful to a British Prime Minister? I'm going to try. So this pantomime that has been going on for, what, 30 months. I think the view from Europe has been one of admiration for that very British resilience that she's shown over the months. But also, I think we've also come to a stage of deep exasperation and also deep concern at, you know, what's going on. But we also see that the opposition, you know, Jeremy Corbyn, there's nothing to admire in his stance about Brexit, because he seems to be on the side. He could be king, really. He's on the side, doesn't want a second referendum. He wants Brexit, really. He's got everything to lose in it, and it is not serving his country either. So the view from Europe, and perhaps Thomas can say what he thinks from the view from Germany, is one of, you know, sadness and exasperation, but also deep concern as time goes by, and of course the deadline looming.
Before we come to Thomas, I just want to ask Isabel, as the only Brit round the table. So we've got this last-minute Heart and Minds campaign by the Prime Minister. We've also got some of her cabinet ministers coming out and talking about a surge in far-right extremism if the withdrawal bill doesn't go through. Now, is that a new Project Fear, or is that a sensible reminder of the least worst option?
Well, if you remember, some weeks ago we had a People's March of some 700,000 people, and we had a Brexit march of 2.5. The far right doesn't have the numbers. I think that's what we've learned, and I think it's pretty disgraceful to see cabinet ministers essentially saying, we'll come and break your windows if we don't, if you don't deliver, which is what they're saying.
Matt planned to do it personally. But...
No, but that is the kind of message of what they're saying, and that's absolutely disgraceful. And we have a government that can't deliver its project. We're beginning to see that Parliament can't deliver this project, and I think that the next step, if we're thinking strategically, has to be that they go back and have another vote. And there's nothing undemocratic about having another vote.
OK, we hear where you stand. Now, Thomas, we heard Shinzo Abe this past week in London standing alongside Theresa May and basically backing her bill, saying the whole world wants to see the avoidance of a no-deal Brexit. It's quite interesting to see a Japanese Prime Minister speaking for the whole world. But leaving that aside, we'll leave John to deal with that. Do you think he's right on the assessment that that's what the world wants?
Well, I think there's a limited use you have for bringing in foreign leaders to help your cause. We saw that at the time of the referendum in 2016, when Barack Obama was called upon by David Cameron to come and help out and plead for the right outcome of the referendum. It didn't happen. It was useless. And the same applies to a Japanese Prime Minister saying his spiel, as it were, about the issue. It is futile to think you can solve the conundrum at the heart of British politics by letting foreign leaders speak out. They have to solve it by their own, as it were, machinations. At the moment, Parliament has taken control. from Theresa May, who has a minority government anyway, and is totally dependent on the votes of the 10 Northern Ireland deputies. I think the situation is such that, to begin with, we're not going to be able to carry the March deadline for Brexit. It's not going to happen because there's so much unfinished business. And Prime Minister May is not Prime Minister of Brexit alone. She's the Prime Minister of the whole country. She has
so
to
what do you expect, an extension
It'll
of
be
Article
extension of Article 15. In the end, I think there will be Brexit because Agnes asked about views in Europe. We are getting to feel that Britain has to get over its own sort of aversion to Europe and get the Brexit done. The proof of Brexit lies in the leaving, is my motto.
So it's kind of climbed to the high board and it now needs to force itself off.
Something has to give, and really Britain has been at loggerheads with Europe for so long. Very few good words have been said in the past about the EU. Even now, there's so much vitriol poured on Brussels. Let's have a separation. Let's have a severance of relations, and then see what happens. As I said, the proof of Brexit lies in the leaving, and then we'll see.
John, just an American view on, first, I mean, the Shinzo Abe point. I mean, do you agree that it's not a moment for foreign leaders? And yet, where is Trump?
Yeah.
Trump. How much time do we have?
On that question, not a lot.
I wanted to make another point on this, which is that I think the story of 2019 will be, on the one hand, that we will show, and I speak as the second Brit on the panel, part of the genius, the political, social genius of this country is to muddle through. I think we will muddle through. I think the media has played its part in slightly overcooking all of this. And
so
at
you
the same
don't think
time,
we're back to the religious wars of the early 17th century?
No, I don't. I think.
Well, I do.
I think there will be.
We didn't muddle through that, did we? I mean, we took people's heads off.
No, I think the extremists will be marginalised, and there's a great deal of common sense to be found in both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party in Parliament, and solutions will be found. But I think as we look for that solution, there's something else we need to look at, and that's what's happening in Europe itself. I think a lot of Europeans, you'll forgive me, speak as if there's something immutable about the European Union and its view on these matters. Actually, the European Union is in flux. It may well be by the middle of the year in great crisis. You can see the rise of identity politics all the way across Europe, not the least in France and Germany and Italy. And I think that we will, as we muddle through, we may find a new, or rather different Europe to negotiate with than the one we've been negotiating with for the past.
So just take us
30
through the
months.
muddling of next week, then, in your view. I mean, obviously, should have declared you as the other Brit. You're not. Are you a Remainer or a Leaver? Just let's know where you stand on the, on the basics.
I think I'm confused.
You're confused.
I think
He's with the majority in that case.
no, yeah, well, I am. I think we'll do fine if Brexit is enacted. I think we'll do fine if we don't. I don't think that this is quite the moment of historic crisis that people have presented
So
it
if
to
we can
be.
sketch out the details of muddling through, do you think that Theresa May's bill is going to go through on
No.
Tuesday? And so do you think that will go from Plan A swiftly to Plan B, or which plan in the alphabet will we get to?
It seems to me most likely she'll find a way, even with the new 3-day deadline that she has, to come up with a Plan B that in one way or another allows for a second and possibly even a third vote on her plan as recast as the weeks passed. But I do think that we will find a way through this, and that it won't be a disaster in either case.
Well, sorry, Carrie, about John's point about Europe and so forth, I agree with him that Europe is not in a very fine fettle at the moment, which leads some people to think that this is not the point to re-enter, as it were, the European Union. They are in a crisis of their own. And that's why I think it'll give succor to the trend towards Brexit at all costs. It will happen some kind or another. It may be a different kind of Brexit than we see at the moment, but they will want out. I don't think they want to decide to rejoin the EU in its current form. That's why I mean proof of Brexit lies in the leaving. You have to let it happen, for goodness sake.
I think, to me, it's worth remembering that when David Cameron ran through his very ineffective renegotiation prior to the referendum, that
didn't get much help.
If the European Union had been a little bit more helpful, that probably we would have had no vote for Brexit. And the same applies now, that a European Union somewhat recast by the elections in May, I believe, by the change, if not a change of leadership, change in the attitude of leadership in France and Germany, presents the possibility for a renegotiation some weeks or months from now, which will be a happier outcome for both
Weeks
Europe
and
and
months
France.
we may or may not have. Isabel, what do you think on the extension of Article 50 point?
Well, I see no way around the extension, because clearly we're not going to resolve this, I don't think, by March the 30th. But, you know, the extension runs into further complications. There are elections in Europe, for example. Britain would technically still be a member. We hold elections for the European Parliament. That seems a bit odd. You know, there are going to be all sorts of other forces that and processes that muddy it further. But I think the real problem is that the instruments by which we might muddle through to some effect or resolve this issue are the two major political parties, the government. Now, the two major political parties are either led by or held hostage by extreme elements of their respective ideologies, and the government is weak. So that no matter how much you postpone it, I don't see these particular instruments, which have been broken for 2 years, suddenly coming together in the way that we need to.
And just a quick question on Agnes's point about Labour. I mean, you mentioned two political parties being extremist or held hostage. Of course, they wouldn't acknowledge that definition. But Labour, we heard Corbyn speaking last week. Is this a moment of seizing the day or a moment of fudge? Where's he going?
Where's Corbyn going is it's a mystery to me. I mean, you want a general election. It's a poison chalice right now. He would still have to, you know, take on this whole European mess. And the fantasy that Labour can go in and negotiate something which is going magically to resolve this, that's just chasing another unicorn across the horizon. You know, he has to, first we have to resolve Brexit, then by all means have a general election. But this has to be resolved. He has 70% of his membership who want to remain. This is a man who pledged to listen to his membership. It's really
so the
tragic.
view on and Agnes, just a very quick one then for you to finish up this mud and muddling. Is that where we're headed for the next few weeks and months in the UK on Brexit?
Well, I wish John was true, but I think it's good also to take to look at the bigger picture. In the last few weeks, I've been reporting on Italian politics, on the Yellow Vest movement in France, and on Brexit. And suddenly I'm growing extremely pessimistic, because it looks as if we're witnessing the end of an era. 70 years of stability, security, paid for by American, the Marshall Plan. And we're going back to, then we need to step back, look at history of Europe. Europe is inherently a very unstable continent, looking back at 1,000 years. And it seems to me, because there's Hungary, there's Poland, there's Austria, there's France now, there's Italy. Brexit is a big chunk of that. But we are losing our collective nerve, and we're spoiled brats. We think stability, security is a given. It's not in Europe. It's too small a space for too much politics.
So is your view that in relation to the Brexit question, that obviously MPs are having to grapple with their consciences as we speak, that when they go to vote on Tuesday, they should consider that if they extended, is your view that if they extended the John solution would kind of come onto the horizon, that there would be some kind of solution because there's a more listening Europe out there?
Well, I mean, a solution must be found, but I think it's really, all I see is division in Europe. And I can't remember who penned that expression, narcissism of small differences. And on the long term, I'm quite pessimistic. So, I mean, Brexit now, is very, it's just one of many, many problems that Europe and Britain, I don't think we should distinguish Britain and Europe. We're all in this together.
So allow me one sentence. Yeah. If the picture that Agnes paints about Europe is right, then if I were an MP, that would strengthen my resolve to leave the Union and stay with Brexit, because in the end, muddling through Britain might be the most stable country amidst all that turmoil that Agnes speaks about.
I think it's worth looking at the timetable to remember that the negotiation of the relationship that the UK will have with Europe lies ahead. There's plenty of flexibility in that, and that negotiation is going to take place during the period when Europe is being recast by its own elections.
It's a moving target, indeed. So we're going to leave that part of the discussion, and we've given MPs plenty to think about, and move from the narcissism of small difference to something which is the narcissism of much bigger differences, because you expect nothing and you are never disappointed. And that is the kind of saying which passes for wisdom in some quarters and certainly seemed to pay off for financial markets this week, because after a grim 2018 in the US-China relationship, expectations of trade talks in Beijing were so low that even a few small crumbs were enough to comfort stock markets and the US dollar. American trade negotiators were not the only visitors to Beijing this week either. The North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, was also in town, talking to Chinese President Xi Jinping about the prospect for a second denuclearization summit with President Trump. Trade and security, two huge dimensions of the US-China relationship, with Kim Jong-un the wild card. So at the start of 2019, how does it all fit together? I think this is a question first for Isabel, as the long-time China watcher in our midst. Let's talk the trade relationship. We saw the talks go into a third day. We saw Chinese making some warmish noises about concessions. We saw President Trump saying there was progress, and we saw markets lift. Do you share the optimism?
Well, I think we've certainly pulled back from the brink. Hanging over all this is the threat that across-the-board tariffs would be imposed by Trump if these talks don't reach some sort of conclusion. On the upside, I think both leaders want a positive result. So Xi Jinping's economy was already in tricky times. You know, we're after the big industrial boom. We're in the middle income kind of very queasy waters. You know, how are we going to get through to the next phase of growth? That's all a long-running problem, the long-running background to this particular crisis. And then comes the crisis, and you know, that really doesn't help. On the other hand, on the US side, you know, there are bits of Trump's heartland that are hurting. So the farmers are hurting. The market, on which he seems to set great store, was deeply troubled. So the fact that at least sensible people are talking and there is something to talk about is positive. And the fact that Liu He, who is the big trade guru on the Chinese side, will indeed visit the United States, all suggest positive momentum and avoiding, you know, the next phase of all-out war. And that's very good. In the longer term, I think that the structural problem remains, which is how do you have a free market relationship between a conventional Western capitalist economy and China, which is not a conventional capitalist economy, in which all the resources of the state are brought to bear on their economic relations, on their industrial policy, and so on. And that creates a profoundly unequal playing field. So the Chinese will grant a little bit more market access. They will make further noises about very, very long delayed economic reforms. But they can only go so far without beginning to unpack a system which has actually been consolidated over the last 5 years. Yes. And that is a system of state control, party control, of industrial policy, of international economic relations, of overseas investment, of all of that thing, which comes together in a package which is the Chinese economy.
OK, we'll deal with the fundamental asymmetry of systems in a moment on this side of the table. But, John, first, I want to talk to you about Trump and push on the points that Isabel's making there, because obviously the farmers, one problem. Also, he's got divisions within his own administration on dealing with China. We've got the hawks and we've got the doves. And, you know, he's got a gridlock and a cabinet and a paralysis politically in Washington at the moment. So how strong is he in coming to this fight with China?
My perspective on this is formed somewhat by the fact that I've recently been to China for the first time in nearly 35 years. And the last time I saw it, I was in a paddy wagon being taken to the airport from the prison where I had been obviously wrongfully imprisoned for allegedly spying. I had read a great deal about China in the ensuing years. I was absolutely unprepared for what I found. The modernization is completely astonishing and wonderful to see. But along with that, it seems to me that China is no longer cannot be any longer the autarky it was in Mao's time when I first made our first football in China. And we're beginning to see that in the flexibility that China is beginning to show in its trade relations with the United States. When I was in the Peking Central Prison, I remember that the total trade between China and the United States, that was in 1987, was less than $1 billion. Now, the United States has a trade deficit with China, which, if I'm not mistaken, is somewhere between 375 and $400 billion a year. That's a real problem. And on this, as on so many other things, I would say, just because you dislike Trump, and there's much to dislike, does not mean that he's wrong about everything.
No,
and
no,
this
one around
issue,
this table is saying that, but so
was
what's
time
does he have the discipline, the patience, and does he have the coherence back home to take on, which, as you've said, is now a huge rising
Well, of course,
power?
part of the answer to that is, will Trump survive as President of the United States? I think that's an open question. But whoever succeeds him is going to have to tackle, whether Democrat or Republican, whether liberal or conservative, is going to have to tackle certain long-running problems. The Mexican border is one of them. The China trade is another. And I think we're beginning to see that China, no longer the autarky that it was, is amenable to change, recognizes that the United States could not continue with the deindustrialization, with the transfer of jobs, that massive trade deficit represents. And again, think me a Pollyanna, if you will, I think that China and the United States will work out these difficulties to a considerable extent for the very simple reason that they have to.
Okay, I just want, sorry, Isabel, I just want to get this side of the table. I want to get the view, because the point that Isabel made about the very asymmetry at the heart of this economic relation. I mean, Germany's a huge trader with China, hugely, dense relationship economically. What's the view from Berlin?
Well, when push comes to shove, I'm sure we would side with Trump in this case, because we're also interested in seeing an amelioration of the Chinese attitude towards trade, much as the state system that they have speaks against this, but we've got to keep on pushing. So we will philosophically side with Trump, much as we have other complaints about him, as John delineated. We've had a big trade with China, but there's been some intellectual property theft, as it were. For example, in the building of fast trains, and so forth, where Germany had was the number one, and the Chinese began to copy it and acquire the technology and the intellectual property, and they're now building fast trains all over the world. So that is a case of the lack of the playing field that Isabel talked about. So I think in this case, we would hope, keep our fingers crossed, that Trump gets somewhere in the current talks, which are a bit of a warming sort of period, somewhat. We don't know eventually whether it'll be altogether positive, but I think we will side with Trump in this dispute.
And Agnes, as you give us the European view in that, because of course Trump's been quite tough on the trade relationship with Europe, only slightly less tough than on the trade relationship with China. Is Europe gritting its teeth as it gets behind him in dealing with
Europeans have a lot to lose in that trade war because they export much more to China than the US does. But, I mean, there's an element of Brexit in that trade wars. It's the uncertainty. The uncertainty is not good for anyone, for importers, exporters, for producers, manufacturers. And at least we can see, from Europe that both sides have interest to actually resolve, or at least, just leave the 10% trade tariffs where they are and not do that another 25% hike in March. And
so crossing fingers, hoping that this truce will prolong.
Yes, because as Thomas said in intellectual property matter, yes, of course, it'd be quite good to see China ease, but also Trump. The financial markets instability is extraordinary to watch, and it's due to, in part, but importantly, to that trade war. So we can't go on.
No. And now we just need to widen security. Isabel, in 2017, I just want to bring in Kim Jong-un. I mentioned him. He's such an interesting wild card in the US-China relationship. We've seen him just make his 4th trip in less than a year to Beijing. Is he turning into the obedient vassal? Is Xi Jinping going to use him as a human shield against against Trump as he effectively did against trade war in 2017. You've got about 45 seconds.
Ooh, I think Kim Jong-un is fantastically interesting because, yes, 4 visits to Beijing, but also to Russia. There's talk of him going to Seoul, which would be the biggest television event anyway. So this is a young man who is actually playing his own cards, I think, pretty skillfully. And he knows how to balance the interests of a very needy American president, a China which is looking to see what advantage it can get out of this situation. And he can always pull in Putin just to kind of say, I'm not friendless. So this is nobody's vassal.
OK, we'll watch him in 2019. I'm really sorry we could have done so much more on that. It's my mismanagement of timings, but that's all we have time for this week. Do join us again next week, same time, same place. For now, thank you all round the table, and thank you for watching. Goodbye.